The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
It's exactly 1 year and counting until the next Ontario election. And so tonight, we thought we'd introduce you to three candidates who will convince you that youth is definitely not wasted on the young. Then, some perspective with a longer view. We look back at how previous elections have been defined, or not, by major and unexpected events. It's Wednesday, June 2nd, and that's all ahead on the agenda. One year from today, Ontarians will go to the polls for the province's 43rd general election. The vast majority of the hundreds of candidates seeking your vote will be in their 40s, 50s, and 60s. But a few will be young, very young. And we thought you'd like to meet some of the youngest candidates to find out why they want your vote. And so we welcome, in Smithville, Ontario, Sam Oosterhoff, the youngest MPP in Ontario history. He got elected 4.5 years ago at age 19. He's the PC member for Niagara West and still that party's youngest candidate on offer. In Belleville, Ontario, Emily Leneveux. She is the youngest candidate running for the Liberals. She's 23 and seeking election in the Bay of Quinte. In Mississauga, Ontario, Abhijit Mane. He is the 31-year-old deputy leader of the Green Party, that party's youngest candidate, and running in Beaches, East York. And for what it's worth, we asked the NDP to offer up their youngest candidate, but they didn't. But we're delighted to have you three here. And just for the record here, I'm trying to figure out which of the three of you is actually, Emily, who is the youngest person here?
Well, I'd like to say it's myself, but I think Sam beats me by all of like 20 days. My birthday's August 3rd, and I think his is August 20th or something.
22nd, yeah. Very close, very close.
Okay,
Yeah,
all right. So Sam takes it by 20 days. Well, Sam, you have done already what these other two hope to do, and that is namely get elected. And I want you to take us back 4.5 years. When you went to people in your riding and said, yes, I'm 19 years old and I want to run for provincial parliament, what was the general reaction you ran into?
There was surprise, but there was also definitely encouragement. People really believe that it's important we have a wide diversity of perspectives around the table in politics. And often what I got from people was a response of saying, you know, I wouldn't want to see a legislature full of 19-year-olds, but I also wouldn't want to see a legislature full of 80-year-olds. And so it's important to have people from every walk of life who are represented in the legislature, people from every background. And I spoke with a lot of people and assured them that I would be advocating for their concerns and their interests. And that's something that I still believe is very, very important, especially as a young person, to ensure that when you are going into elected office, you're there to represent the concerns of the people that you're advocating for, and not just coming at it as though you have all the answers. I always said, you know, you might be young, but you have to work twice as hard as the next person to get ahead in that case. It means you listen to good advice and you pay very close attention to the wisdom of those who've gone before you.
And a brief follow-up. Had anyone in your family ever run for office before?
No, not in my immediate family, no.
So where would you get the notion that this was something that somebody that young could do?
Well, a lot of it came from seeing some of the great people throughout history who had the opportunity to run and make a great deal of difference at a young age. I think, of course, of Winston Churchill, who, if my memory serves me correctly, was only 26 when he was elected. Of course, William Wilberforce, an abolitionist who was elected at a very young age as well as a member of Parliament in England. And both of those men went on to accomplish a great deal in their respective parliaments. So I think we've seen throughout history that there are people who are able to step forward and contribute in powerful ways. Here in Ontario as well, there have been young MPPs in the past. Looking at the CCF, for example, they elected a young member, Scott Reed, I believe his name was. So it's possible to make a big difference. But again, to represent the people that you're fighting for, to hear what they are speaking about and to bring those concerns forward is the top priority.
Emily, you're 23, as we already established. Why does a 23-year-old want to run for provincial parliament in the Bay of Quinte?
Yes, I think first and foremost, to Sam's point, it's so important that we amplify all voices that are marginalized, not just the youth vote. And we are representing everyone in our riding and all of our constituents. But that being said, I also do want to bring that youth lens, and I'm so excited to be able to hopefully bring more of a youth lens to Parliament. And I think it's so imperative, again, that we're amplifying the voices of all of our youth. But I'm also really excited to sort of bring the audacity of an experience. And it is important that we work twice as hard, and we know that we are kind of, I guess, behind when it comes to experience, but we have the audacity of being a little bit inexperienced and innovative and wanting to really affect change. So I think it's a really exciting time to be a young person in politics. And it's definitely something I've been thinking of from a young age myself. I remember learning about the political system, I think something like grade 3, and just knowing that I wanted to somehow enter that realm. So it's definitely an exciting time.
Anyone in your family ever run before?
I believe my grandfather actually ran. So if I'm not mistaken, he ran for a counselor in Ajax. And then he did also run, I believe it was provincially as well, but for the NDP in Ajax as well. And if I'm not mistaken, he got second or third.
And how long ago would that have been?
Ooh, good question. I think something like 50 or 60 years ago now. Or maybe a little less.
So
like
it's been a long time
between
since
40
anyone in your
50
family
years.
went for it. Okay, so a long time since anyone in your
yeah.
family's gone for it. Anybody in your family try to talk you out of this, saying, Emily, like, why bother?
I definitely wouldn't say talk me out of it. I did receive a little bit of hesitation in that everyone in my family obviously wanted to make sure that I was ready and I was in a good place to step up to the plate. I mean, mental health is so important, and being a younger candidate, that's something that I'm really focused on. So everyone was definitely supportive and just wanting to make sure I was ready, but I think it was time to answer the call. So again, I'm really excited.
Now, Abhijit, I know your grandfather was a member of parliament back in India, and I wonder how influential his example was to you in your wanting to stand for provincial parliament here.
It was the crucial example that actually got me into politics or interested in politics in the first place, because he was one of the first parliamentarians, member of parliament in India's parliaments post-independence from the British Empire. He was also actively involved in the independence movement itself. But he was also the kind of parliamentarian who's in it for the right reasons and belonged to a generation who did that, who really stood up for social justice issues. He often worked for the so-called low castes in India and helped establish villages for them because they were being ostracized. He also helped the poorest sections of the city of Mumbai as well by building bridges and roads for them. And he never really talked about his accomplishments with family. We only learned about these things after he passed away from well-wishers and supporters. So that real example of what service, what duty is supposed to be, what politics is supposed to be, he exemplified that every single day. And his example inspires me to continue that legacy.
Okay, having said all that, anybody here try to talk you out of running?
I mean, I think the biggest voice inside my head who was dissuading me from running was my own, because I had seen what politics is. It's a lot of sacrifice. It's a lot of my uncle up until recently was also an MLA in Mumbai, and so I've seen what toll it can take on your personal life, on everyone around you, and so that was, I think, the biggest factor. But when I joined the Green Party because I believe the climate emergency is the biggest facing humankind up until now. And so when the call to duty is that strong, I think a little sacrifice goes a long way.
Sam, I want you to pick up the story here, if you would, and that is a lot of older people think that years and years of experience, life experience, political experience, is important to bring into politics before you stand for office. And obviously, the three of you, before you all ran for the first time, had very little life experience and very little political experience. In which case, what do you think you bring to the table that compensates for that lack of experience?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's one that I found came up a lot during the by-election. By the time the election rolled around 3 years ago, we've been able to work on a number of different files, and I've been able to show that really what is important is being a collaborator, being someone who brings people together, and listening to the good advice. So recognizing that as a young person, you might not have experience, but you also have the opportunity to have that open mind and to speak with people from various backgrounds without some of the experience that also ends up impacting the way you view those perspectives. So there's absolutely aspects of it that could be considered a liability from some people's point of view, but there's also aspects of it which are a benefit, and that's being able to speak to people with that perspective of saying, look, I don't have all the answers. I don't claim to have all the answers. I want to hear from you. What do you think the solutions are? How can we bring people together in ways that build solutions going forward for the challenges that are facing us, whether that's the environment, the economy, COVID, of course, right now, or education. There's so many different areas that need so many people to participate to move forward. And that's been very, very beneficial to have those conversations and be frank with people about the areas that you might not have all the answers.
Emily, you talked about the audacity of inexperience in your first answer. What does that mean exactly?
To me, it means bringing in an innovative approach to anything that we do. And I think as a younger candidate, bringing that youth lens, not only to amplify the voice of youth, but again, to amplify all voices that may have been marginalized. I think it gives us a little bit of an edge when it comes to perhaps looking at things with a fresh perspective, and also perhaps seeing the gaps that are hard to see when you've been in it or you've been working on a project for so long. So just coming in with that fresh perspective, I think, to Sam's point, allows for so much collaboration and that fresh perspective. And I think the audacity piece is just that little edge that youth bring. And I think that's something that we need to see in provincial parliament, and we need to hold everyone accountable while being collaborative. So it's, again, an exciting time. And I think that youth voice needs to be heard a little bit more. And I'm excited to hopefully see more youth in provincial parliament.
Abhijit, how about you on that?
Yeah, I think it's a completely fair criticism, because there's such a wealth of experience that exists for many different politicians before they even enter politics. So when you enter in your 20s or 30s, which is why I was so apprehensive about entering in my 20s. When I first ran, I was 28. And so what I thought was, well, it's important that you need to have those life experiences. But when you are a younger candidate, I think you have to work, as Sam mentioned, doubly hard, because you have to overcome those barriers that exist, but at the same time, also have the humility to know that you don't know all the answers, and therefore you need to look to experience for guidance. But at the same time, I think because there is such an ossification of political thought or practices that happen in Queen's Park because of that older demographic. I think when a younger and a fresher voice is brought in, it can bring a different perspective. And that's what we always need, is diversity of perspectives, because that's what brings out the most engaged as well as the most complete holistic answer.
I just want to check. You said ossification, not Osterhoffication. Is that right?
That is correct.
Just checking. Okay. Want to make sure I heard you properly. Just kidding.
To not be partisan.
I was hoping someone would say that.
I'm nothing if not predictable, Emily. There we go. Sam, okay, let me ask you the tougher question, though, Sam, and that is, all right, you're in a caucus meeting, or you're in a meeting with stakeholders, or you're in a meeting with people in your riding, and as probably is often the case, you're the youngest person in a room. And, can you really have an influence, or do people really listen to what you have to say when you're almost always the youngest person in the room?
Yeah, that's a great question, Steve. And I think it's important to also look at the results of the past few years. In my local community, for example, there was a hospital that had been canceled under the former government that had been fought for since 1997 and had been shelved, essentially. I was able to work with my community and the Premier and Minister Elliott to bring that project back to life, and we now see it going out to tender, to RFQ. So we're having a new hospital come on. Bill 3, the Compassionate Care Act, on a palliative care strategy being put in place across Ontario, was a piece of legislation I brought forward, working with colleagues from all the other parties. We made amendments, literally from the Green, the Liberals, and the NDPs. We made amendments to the legislation in several days of committee hearings. We were able to bring it back, and it passed unanimously. bringing attention to clean energy. I brought forward a motion on hydrogen technologies and the economic and environmental potential of these technologies. We see the federal government now also bringing forward efforts in this regards, working with their provincial partners. So I think what has to happen if you're a young person is, as I mentioned, being willing to take the advice of those who've gone before you, but also accept the fact that people aren't going to accept right away that you are capable until you prove that you are. And that means going out there, getting results, and then being able to say, listen, here are some of the things we've been able to work on. Let's do more together going forward.
Emily, I don't know if you found yourself in similar circumstances. For example, maybe your leader or your party president has had a Zoom call with all the nominated candidates, or I don't know what, but I'm betting there have been occasions over the past several months where you found yourself to be the youngest person in the room, on the Zoom feed, at the meeting, whatever. Do you get the sense that anybody really cares what you have to say?
Absolutely. To be honest, I was a little worried in the beginning. I remember jumping on our first Super Caucus meeting with all of our MPPs and candidates and being a little nervous and wondering if the reception would be there for a younger candidate. And I was very much welcomed with open arms. And I think the only thing that I still kind of laugh about a little bit is when I often get the answer of, oh, that's so radical, or oh my goodness, what a radical idea. And sometimes I don't think the things that I'm saying to any party or to any constituent are, outlandish. So it's interesting to see just how much we'll have to work to get the support on our side for some of those youth lens or youth oriented ideas. But again, I've been welcomed with open arms in terms of my age, and I normally am the youngest person on our Zoom calls, but I wouldn't say that that's something that's noticeable if you were to just walk into the room or at the Zoom screen, if you will. So yes, so far a good experience that way.
Abhijit, any difficulties in your world on being taken seriously when you are, as is I'm sure often the case, the youngest person in the room or on the Zoom feed?
Well, I'm 31 now, so I'm less than often the youngest person in the room. But I definitely, I think that's also an indication of where the Green Party is headed, is attracting a lot of the Canadian youth. And so I often am not the youngest person by a mile. But despite that, whenever I am definitely taken seriously to the point where, and to the credit of Green Party leadership, Mike Schreiner, leader of the Green Party of Ontario, has always trusted me with his voice, which is why I became deputy leader. But also there are many different responsibilities given to me to this day within the party itself. I'm co-chair of the shadow cabinet. I'm also co-chair of the platform committee, as well as I'm on the provincial executive. So in all those arenas, the party has constantly shown that it is ready to empower young voices, and that's absolutely a necessary thing.
Emily, I want to circle. Oh yeah, go ahead, please.
I just wanted to build off of something that you mentioned about not being the youngest earlier, because last election, actually, it was really, really amazing. We had from the Green Party, 18-year-old Jessica Tillman. She was the candidate in Niagara West. We had 20-year-old candidate for the NDP. We had a 26-year-old member for, candidate running for the Liberals, Joe Caney. And then I also was at the time 20 as well. So we had all younger candidates actually in the riding, and it was very interesting to see the level of debate that happened as a result of that age, because there were a lot more ideas and less personal attacks than I've experienced in the past. It was pretty neat to see.
Interesting. Emily, I wanted to point out to you something that I'm sure you're extremely well aware of, and that is that the guy who currently holds your riding, Todd Smith, won by 8,000 votes last time, which is not close. And I wonder did you think about contesting a more winnable riding? Let me put it that way.
Honestly, I grew up in the Bay of Quinte. I have always loved our beautiful riding, and I did briefly consider maybe shifting over to Hastings or shifting over to another county, but of course I'm sort of surrounded by ministers, if you will. We have Daryl Cramp, we have Todd Smith, we have lots of MPPs that have lots of experience. And I think regardless of where I run, first and foremost, I don't want to think of the vote count as much as it's definitely always in the back of our mind when we're making phone calls. I want to think of the riding that I can best represent. And for me, that's definitely the Bay of Quinte. I briefly grew up in the beaches before moving to the Bay of Quinte. So I was in Toronto up until grade 3, and the Bay of Quinte just definitely feels like home. I would say I definitely still have some ties in Toronto, but I feel so attached to the Bay of Quinte. It just made sense.
That's a good reason to run there then. Abhijit, I'll ask you the same kind of question. You're contesting Beaches East York. By my count, the NDP has won Beaches East York 6 of the last 7 elections, and the last time out in 2018, they won it by 11,000 votes. Again, not close, and the Greens came 4th. Did you consider contesting an election where the Greens have been more traditionally competitive?
Yeah, those are far scarce options for Greens out there compared to our NDP, Liberal, or Conservative colleagues for a quote unquote better riding. But I think what that means is that Greens are willing to put their name forward in every single place in Ontario. I chose Beaches East York because that's where I first arrived when I landed first in Canada in 2005. That's where I grew up. I went to Danforth Tech collegiate for high school, and so those are their old stomping grounds. And I feel a real connection to that community. It's a very progressive community, as you mentioned. The NDP and the Liberals have sort of switched back and forth, which is why I think the argument that that normally stifles green progress, which is strategic voting, isn't really a factor, because a lot of folks don't want Conservatives to win, so they vote for either the Liberals or the NDP, whoever's strongest. So in this case, you don't really have to worry about that, because the Conservatives really won't be winning in Beaches East York. So you can really vote your heart out there, which really is something that we're working on. And also, this is going to be unlike any campaign that Beaches East York has seen before. It's a serious campaign. We're already fundraising, we're already making calls, and the response that we're getting is really phenomenal.
All right. In our last few minutes here, Sam, I'm going to get you to give these other two some advice, because as I suggested off the top, you are now where they hope to be. You are the guy who got elected. One of the things that you decided, though, when you ran for the by-election, was to run in a riding that was a pretty reliably conservative riding. You weren't trying to swim upstream in the way that these other two have been. Is that part of the trick in this, do you think? Pick a riding where your party at least has got a shot? What's your advice on that front?
No, this is my home riding. I'm born and raised here, lived here my entire life. I can't imagine representing another area. The people who I fight for at Queen's Park are my neighbors, my friends, the people I see when I go to the grocery store. I was born in the hospital and now we're getting a new one. At the time I was born, they were fighting for a new one, and now we're able to get it. Things like that, I think really, really matter. So I really empathize with the considerations that people have for quote unquote, safer ridings. But I think when it comes down to it, you have to run in a place where you're able to connect and represent the people on the street. And I have a lot of admiration for both of my colleagues here who are running in ridings that might be a little tougher for their particular parties, but clearly they're debating ideas, and they're debating bringing forward ways that they can serve the people in their community. So I think that's admirable. I would just say, the advice that I have is the same advice that I tell people all the time. Listen to good advice. Surround yourself with wise people who have more experience, especially if you're younger, and you do have to work twice as hard when you're a bit younger. I would also say, just remember that you don't walk for office, you run for office. So be willing to do a lot of work, and it will pay off whether or not you win.
And does your admiration reach such levels for them, Sam, that you both hope that they win their seats?
Well, I will say I'm hoping that in the Beaches East York, if you get all three parties, the NDP, the Liberals, and the Greens, with enough of a split, then maybe the Conservatives actually do have a shot. So keep going. I'm hoping to see that happen. But no, in all seriousness, I do wish my colleagues the very best. I know it's going to be a very busy year, especially with the changes of COVID and impacting campaigning. I know that's changed our strategy. Normally, I'm out on the doors in the summer visiting people. We'll see what ends up happening this year as a result. But I think it's going to be impressive to see how people interact with the issues, especially coming out of this global pandemic.
3 young voices running for office: Sam Osterhoff, Emily Lenevue, Abhijit Mane. We thank the 3 of you for coming on to TVO tonight, and we hope you enjoy the next year of your lives, because I got a feeling it's going to be busy as hell.
Thank you.
That's absolutely right. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
The old expression says, a week is a lifetime in politics. So there are 52 lifetimes until the next Ontario election. But we've also seen that those lifetimes can fly by. Ontario goes to the polls June 2nd, 2022, exactly 1 year from today. Does history offer any valuable lessons for the circumstances politicians today find themselves in? Let's ask. In Ajax, Ontario, Janet Ecker. She's a former Ontario Minister of Finance. In the Riverdale neighborhood of the provincial capital, former MPP Tim Murphy, Managing Director at the Macmillan Vantage Policy Group, and from the downtown core, Robert Benzie, Queen's Park Bureau Chief for the Toronto Star. And it's great to have you 3 with us for this look down memory lane, I guess, a little bit in Ontario political history. Robert, I'm going to get you to start us off here, because every government 3 years into office has to look back and say, we could have done this better, we should have done that better. Looking back at this current Ontario government's first 3 years in office, what's on your list of unambiguous, unforced errors?
Well, I think the biggest unforced error that Premier Doug Ford has had, I think, Steve, is aside from the pandemic, any issues in the pandemic, because I think the history is still to be written on the pandemic. But I think before COVID-19 rocked our world and changed everything, I think the Premier's biggest blunder, frankly, was his bid to have his friend Ron Taverner be the OPP commissioner. Superintendent Taverner is a mid-level Toronto police officer in his 70s and a close Ford family friend. And remember, in 2018, the Premier thought this was a very good idea to have the provincial police force be run by someone he was close to personally. And I think that really, really hurt the Premier. He backed off, but it took months, and it was a debilitating episode. And it was also a lesson of the possible and the impossible for a new government. I think when you take the reins of power, as both Tim and Janet know, you kind of think, oh, I can do whatever I want, or you think you can be omniscient and do whatever you want. And then you realize there are practical considerations along the way to governing the largest province in Canada.
Well, that may have set in a narrative for Doug Ford, but I don't mean this in any disrespectful way whatsoever, but then the coronavirus pandemic came, and it gave him an opportunity to completely change the narrative on the first couple of years of his government. So Janet, Tim, I'll get you to come in and sort of follow up on the story. We have seen in the past that 3 years in, a narrative can get formed that is impossible to break. Polling showed that it happened to Bob Rae, it happened to Kathleen Wynne. Doug Ford, for whatever reason, Janet, is still in the game. Why do you think that is?
Well, one of the reasons I think is, first of all, I mean, we are in a pandemic, and I think most people, even though we might get frustrated and irritated at some of the things that are happening, I think most people recognize that this is a sort of a whole new situation for everybody. There is no playbook, and governments around the world are making good steps and bad steps. And, so I think that's one thing. People recognize the situation we're in. But I think one of the big benefits, if you will, or one of the strong traits that the Premier has, which has gotten him through and could get him through again for the next year, is that authentic way. I mean, what you see is what you get. I mean, he's not somebody who's spinning you a line. He's telling you what he really thinks, good, bad, or whatever. And I think that authenticness, if I can put it that way, in this day and age in politics is really, really important. Whether you're good or bad, whether they agree or they don't agree, they want to know you're a real person who feels, who, goes up, goes down, who learns. And I think he's a real person.
Tim, his personal popularity and the party's popularity, the PC party's popularity, are not certainly as robust as they were on election day back in 2018, but they're also not in Bob Rae, Kathleen Wynne territory. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think, to be honest with you, I think because, going back to Robert's point, there are, in my view, three types of blunders politician makes. And there's policy blunders, character blunders, and strategy blunders. And I think, Doug Ford committed the worst kind of blunder out of the gate, which is character blunders, with Ron Tavener wanting the van, Dean French appointing friends. And then the pandemic came along and in that great Harold Macmillan quote that the biggest thing that can change you off course in politics are events, dear boy, events. The pandemic came along and it allowed him to reestablish his character a bit along the lines that Janet was speaking to. I think it's deteriorated because he was, I think, losing the plot a bit over the last 3 or 4 months. And from a character point of view, the rationale for doing things and what he was doing started to be disconnected. So people could kind of return to an older view of him. That being said, I think, he hasn't completely lost the plot. And I think the blunder in strategy that was happening has been corrected. The government's he's been taken out of the news cycle. They've tried to retreat him from carrying the message every day and focus him on things that he's better at. And so I think there's, we're a year out. I think to your point, there's still a path for, Doug Ford to be reelected.
Robert, let me get your take on this in this regard. We have seen in other provinces, and I look at Alberta, for example, with Jason Kenney, who came into office much more popular than Doug Ford did in the province of Ontario. But the coronavirus certainly changed the narrative in Alberta and established a narrative that Jason Kenney is finding it incredibly difficult to build out from under. Doug Ford is still in the game. What are you seeing that might explain reasons why?
Well, I mean, I think one thing is Ontario isn't Alberta, right? I mean, in Alberta, a conservative leader like Kenney wins more than 50, I think Kenney won something like 57% of the vote, and you can lose and win more than 50% of the vote as a Tory in Alberta, which is extraordinary. Mr. Ford here in Ontario, of course, wins just 40% of the vote and has a majority government, and his team would be very happy if he were at 40% right now and would be definitely in the game for getting reelected a year from now. I think his pandemic performance has been largely better than Mr. Kenney's, I would argue, in the sense that other than in the third wave, which I think has been problematic when he reopened too early, I think Mr. Ford's first sort of from last March until, maybe November, he was very methodical and rational and reasonable, and he seemed like he was in control of the situation, and that events, as Tim says, were not getting ahead of him. That certainly changed in the new year, and this third wave has really walloped Ontario worse than in other parts of the country. I mean, remember, in Quebec, with 60% of our population, they've had 27% more deaths than we have. But earlier in this year, that was 40% more deaths. So their death rate is slowing while ours has stayed steady because of this fourth wave or third wave. Please, let's not have a fourth wave.
Yes. Take that back, please. Yes, indeed. Okay, let me change the focus a little bit here, Janet, to this. We have seen again where a couple of premiers in the past that we've named, Bob Rae, Kathleen Wynne, for example, their popularity went way down and they were unable, regardless of what they tried, to bring it back up. We have seen other premiers whose popularity really takes a dive, and I think of Bill Davis in 1975. I think of Dalton McGuinty in 2007. They're going into their second terms. They look like they're dead ducks, and somehow they figure out a way to bring it back and they win again. What are the conditions that allowed them to do that?
Well, I think it's what Premier Davis did after because in 71, big majority, and then almost lost it all in 75, when there was a series of things that people thought were scandals and whatever, and he was pictured in a pinstripe suit with a cigar, all this, And what they did after 75, I mean, he hired a couple of really smart people, Hugh Siegel, who we've seen on this show many times, Sally Barnes, a number of other, Ed Stewart. And what they did was remake him in a way that the authentic Bill Davis came out. So that, described often as Brampton Billy, in an affectionate way. And he kind of turned into your sort of famous or a favorite uncle, if I can put it that way. And so it just a complete strategic assessment of what was wrong, where are we, what mistakes have we made, what can we learn from them, what can we put out there that will change the story, change the narrative. And they did a superb job. And of course, I think one of the reasons it worked was because it was Bill Davis. I mean, you can't build a persona with a politician that isn't real, because sooner or later the voters see through that. So it was something that was very, I think, legitimate, fit the times, fit his persona, and also to fit his style of governing, because it was minority in 75 and again in 77. And they actually, he was one of those politicians that was able to work across the aisle. I think voters, even though when you look at some voting results in the States, you kind of wonder about this, but frequently voters like a politician who is not a hard partisan, who can actually seem to be reasonable and reach across the aisle. And I think Bill Davis could be, even though he was partisan, could be a very, very good and very adept at that.
Tim, what are the different conditions that you see that allow some leaders who appear to be toast to come back?
So I go back to my sort of three kinds of blunders: character, strategy, and policy. And I think generally it's, I think to Janet's point, what Bill Davis managed to do was reset all three. He did that post-election in 75, because I think he carried the image of, frankly, slightly out of touch, arrogant, the cigar smoking, and they completely reset his character. But they also did some major policy shifts around things like rent control on the Spadina Expressway, and a set of things that moved him, in essence, more to the center from a policy point of view, and from a strategy point of view, tried to kind of make him, in a personal sense, more a person of the middle in Ontario, which he clearly kind of, occupied significantly until, effectively David Peterson beat Frank Miller, 10 years later. I think Bob Rae in 1995 had a different problem. He didn't actually have a character problem, in my view. I think he set out on a policy path in the face of an enormous recession that I think alienated some of his core, and was just, frankly, the kind of one in an accidental sense, and was never able to get out of the policy and events trap that framed him. And I think, and then you could rush forward to Kathleen Wynne, who carried some considerable unpopularity into that election, but was 14 plus 15 years into a government. And, sometimes just the weight of decisions and events and the challenges you create, you just can't get over. And I think that was something that was unfixable. Yeah. And her character, I think, was something that was fixed in the public mind and also not unfixable or not fixable.
I do want Robert to pick up on that. But before you do, it just popped into my head that tomorrow is the 50th anniversary of Bill Davis's speech to stop the Spadina Expressway. And that speech, almost as much as anything, helped him win the 1971 majority government that he'd go on to win in October.
Yeah.
Anyways, that little aside. Okay, Robert, pick up the story from this vantage point. And it really comes from the end of what Tim was saying. How much of a factor in whether you've got a shot to be elected or reelected is carrying the water of your predecessors?
Oh, it's a huge factor, Steve. I think, to Tim's point, Kathleen Wynne won a surprise majority. I think a lot of us were surprised in 2014 when she seized victory from the jaws of defeat. Because remember, in 2013, when Dalton McGuinty finally left, that was a government that was embroiled in the gas plants debacle and had a lot of mileage on it. Mr. McGuinty had been around for almost a decade, and I think that people were ready for a change. And Premier Wynne really resuscitated her party with the help of folks like Tim, frankly, and it was 2014 was a really big victory for the Liberals, and a surprising one. However, the hangover of the McGuinty years, I think, caught up with Ms. Wynne in 2018, and I think it was weird. People were talking about the gas plants affair in the 2018 election, and those of us in the cognoscenti had thought it was really kind of resolved after 2013, and it just wasn't. And I think that's one of the things that, not to pick on Tim, but Tim had to deal with this with Paul Martin as well. Like Paul Martin had to carry a lot of water for Jean Chrétien's problems. John Turner had to carry Pierre Trudeau's water. I mean, it's just one of the things that sometimes happens. Janet knows this. She was Ernie Eves's finance minister. So there were issues that that government had to deal with, that Premier Eves had to deal with, that weren't his fault, that they were to do with Mike Harris, his predecessor. So it's one of these things that when you get into dynasties, and Bill Davis really is the survivor, the remarkable one, that he was able to go take all of the things that had happened under John Robarts and his predecessors, Leslie Frost and others, and not wear them. And in fact, I still believe that if Mr. Davis hadn't retired in 1984, the Tories would have won a majority in 1985.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, Tim, maybe you can help explain how dynasties do last. I mean, the Tories went for 42 straight years, so carrying water for the predecessor didn't seem to be a problem for Frost, Robarts, and Davis. But then other times, as Robert just explained, it really is. So when is it and when is it not a problem?
Well, I think it's a couple of things. One of which is, I think the news cycle has considerably advanced. It's got a 24-hour news cycle. The weight of decisions, and the degree to which people have a loyalty to a party or an institution has dropped significantly. So, some of the factors that would, you're born a liberal, die a liberal is no longer true, or for any of the parties. And so there's more, people who will respond to a leader-centric view. So it's a very leader-centric environment. So all of those things drive you away from the ability to have a, sort of an institutional strength like the Tories did in Ontario for 42 years. I do think you can, you need to, if you're going to win in an environment where you've succeeded a long-term leader, you're kind of starting from scratch. So you give the opposition leaders an opportunity to say, hey, if you want to change, pick me. And so in that environment, you've got to frame yourself as the best option and find a way to move away from some of the sins of the past. Paul Martin, we were able to do that in 2004 to some degree, although we still had the hangover of the sponsorship scandal, because frankly, a lot of people thought Paul was different than Jean Chrétien. By 2006, we'd accumulated our own baggage and down we went. And I think, so Kathleen in 2014 was able to, frame herself as the best choice among Tim Hudak and Andrea Horwath. By 2018, the burden of her own sins and those of Dalton McGuinty. Wait, weirdly enough, to Robert's point, the gas plants issue was in our own internal polling more cogent an issue in 2018 than it was in 2014, strangely enough.
That is strange. Okay, Janet, here's where you get to tell some tales out of school. I want to know, when you were sitting there as the Minister of Finance at the cabinet table in the Ernie Eves government, how often someone around that table would say, damn it all, we're still carrying water for these decisions of the Mike Harris years?
Well, sometimes if you were the minister that had told a previous leader not to do something and the person did it, and it came back again, there was blowback against the government, that minister may well be a bit negative, going forward. But I think one of the important things about a cabinet is that you've got diversity of opinion around that table. What you never want to have is a room full of people that all think the same way and all want to come at an issue the same way. And the trick for a leader is to listen to that, and then at the end of the day, pick a side, make a decision, decide, where you're going to go next. But you need that diversity. So, I've been in a lot of cabinet meetings under both Premier Harris and Premier Eves, where there were some pretty strong arguments and pretty strong opinions and the odd banging of the table from time to time. But you don't want everybody sitting there nodding, yes, sir, no, sir, 3 bags full, sir, because that's guaranteed to kill you in the end. And if I can just point to your previous question on Tim, I think one of the problems, and Tim touched on it, is that in the current political environment, the political culture that we, all of those in politics have to function in, it's not a question these days of I'm just irritated with the government. Through Twitter, social media, all of the other things that are happening, people hate the government. They want to figuratively kill the government. There's just an emotion. And someone was at a consultation session for an organization I'm affiliated with a week or so ago, and they said and this was just somebody who's a competent technocrat, if you will, in this issue, and they just couldn't believe, they call it the politicization of the issue, but it was all along party lines. Like they said, you can practically tell who was sort of supporting what party by the way they were coming at the issue. But the emotion, the anti-emotion and the for emotion and whatever, it just blew them away. And I think in that kind of environment, it's very difficult for a politician to carry the baggage, if you will, of their predecessor if that hate has locked in. And I think we saw it with Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. He had left, but by the time he left, there was such a passion against the man that poor Kim Campbell in many ways didn't have a chance. I mean, people wanted to sort of hit back, wanted to punish, whatever. And I think that's a new twist. Bill Davis did not have to deal with quite that kind of environment, and now we do. So it's tougher to be in politics. Absolutely.
Well, Robert, Doug Ford's a rookie premier. Is that a big advantage to him going into his second election campaign?
You know what, Steve, it could be. The thing is, though, to Janet's point, in our polarized politics, and Mr. Ford is someone a little like Kathleen Wynne that people have strong opinions about. The people who like Kathleen Wynne and like Doug Ford like them a lot. The people who don't like them have this visceral reaction that is quite frankly over the top and unhinged. I'm staggered when I read statements about Ford, and how draconian he supposedly is, when in fact, if you look at it dispassionately, he's governing as a red Tory, a big spending government that is not anti-union necessarily. It really isn't. I mean, he gave teachers a raise last year, signed contracts with them all, avoided strikes, and yet there's still this feeling out there that he is this great villain. And I think that's the problem. We caricaturize our political leaders. I see the same thing with Justin Trudeau. Conservatives they see Trudeau on television and they lose their minds. Liberals and New Democrats see Ford on television, they lose their minds. And it's not necessarily good for our politics, because at the end of the day, especially in a pandemic, we expect our leaders to be working together, and we expect them to do something for the greater good. And I think by and large, our political leaders have been trying to do that. I think during this pandemic, the Prime Minister and the Premier have worked very closely together. So in terms of, back to your question, Steve, whether Mr. Ford not carrying any water for a predecessor, sure, I think that's helpful to him now. But I think there's no corporate memory, it seems like, these days. I mean, people they just have such a hatred for a person, whether it's Trudeau or Ford, that they lose all. It's not about, well, I liked Paul Martin, so I'm going to like Justin Trudeau, or I liked Ernie Eves, so I'm going to like Doug Ford. It's just a different kind of a vibe out there right now.
Janet, only 3 elected premiers in 150 plus years of Ontario history have failed to win re-election. Only 3. So it suggests that Ontarians, for whatever reason, are inclined to give somebody they've put into office the first time a second kick at it. Do you see that as well?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think, again, getting back to the fact that Mr. and Mrs. Front Porch can be quite fair and rational in their political choices. And I know when I ran with Mike Harris in 1999, so that was, we'd won the majority in 95, in 99. And I remember one guy at the door, I said, he'd supported me in 95. I asked for support in 99. And he looked at me and he said, why do you want to go back? Like, why do you want to win re-election again? And I sort of gave him a couple of bullet points, that you've got in your little speech you're supposed to do at the door. And he said, no, why do you want to go back? Why do you want to be in government? And he really pushed me. And I finally looked at him and I said, because the job we promised you we would do in 95 isn't done yet. And he said, precisely. You got my vote. So I think there is a bit of a sense, unless you really tick people off, or there's been a real, external event, black swan event or whatever. I think Ontarians are prepared to give you a second chance, but it's not a guarantee in this day and age. Absolutely. And I also think we don't know what the environment's going to be like post-pandemic, and that's making a big assumption that there is something called a post-pandemic. We don't know. People are mad, they're angry, they're irritated at everybody. There's emotion out there. People, it's just coloring, I think, everything people do. And so I'm not sure where that's going to land us next year when we do the run up to the June election. What's going to be driving them? Are they just going to be sitting here saying, "Oh, thank God the pandemic's over. I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to think about it." And it's almost like it's a fresh page for Premier Ford. On the other hand, if things continue to get worse, and right now luckily numbers are going down, but we've been there before. Will he carry the can for that? Or will people say, hey, he did his best, he tried, he's only human? It's tough to know, because we've got, no matter what the government has done, right? No matter what they've done, there is just a chorus, a Greek chorus, yammering on either side. No, you didn't do it the right way, or you need to do more, or you need to do less. It's just a phenomenal pressure cooker. And I thought, and it did get a mixed vibe, but I thought his sort of writing to all the experts on this school closing or opening and saying, come on, guys, give me an opinion here. Is there a consensus? Because we've all heard experts on the media, and God bless them, they know more about all of this than any of us do in terms of pandemics, but they would say, well, we think the government should do X. And the odd reporter would say, well, okay, what specifically should they do? And they would dodge the question. I mean, so there's a lot of going on in the background that I think people are frustrated with, and we'll see how it all plays out a year from now.
Well, we've been talking exclusively about premiers here, but Tim, we shouldn't forget about the fact that they're not the only ones who make unforced errors. Opposition leaders do, leaders of third parties do. What comes to mind when we think about the people who were trying to become premier, but made a bad mistake and therefore never got into the chair?
Yeah, so again, I go back to my policy, strategy, character blunders. I think Andrea Horwath in the last provincial election committed a strategy blunder that potentially cost her the premier's chair. You go back a week before the 2018 election, the NDP was depending on the polling company, at or near the top, above the Conservatives, and by the time the election, they'd slid into second place, and Doug Ford had his majority. And I think the strategy error in that point was she campaigned to govern as opposed to campaign against Doug Ford. And as a result of which, you actually saw Liberal voters move to support Doug Ford because they prefer Doug Ford to Andrea Horwath. And then you can see policy errors, like you look at John Tory, who ran in religious schools, or Tim Hudak's 100,000 job cuts in the civil service, which I think were meant to galvanize certain communities, and ended up galvanizing a whole lot of people that they didn't intend to. And I think those were kind of policy errors, by them as opposition. But I think at the end of the day, to be fair to Tim Hudak and fair to John Tory, he was running in a context where, to your earlier question, a premier was running for re-election the first time, and they are tough to supplant because, frankly, unless something exceptional happens, you haven't accumulated enough of the barnacles of governing for people to go, it's time to go.
Robert, how about you? Opposition leaders or leaders of third parties who've blown their chance to get into the premier's chair?
Yeah, I mean, I think Tim outlined the ones that I would cite in terms of what happened to Mr. Hudak in 2011, and then again in 2014, and John Tory certainly with faith-based schools in 2007. It's a strange situation, because I think that Tim makes a very good point that Andrea Horwath, I was on her campaign bus in the last 2 weeks of that campaign, and in 2018, and you felt like they were going to win. We were in Stratford. And we ran into David Peterson on the street, and Peterson comes and gives her a friendly handshake, and the media cameras all swarm around the former premier and the presumed next premier. And things were going badly for Doug Ford in that campaign at that point. But then Ms. Horwath didn't fire some errant candidates that she should have fired. Remember the Poppy lady, and then there was the Nazi meme lady. You got to fire bad candidates. And the Tories battened down the hatches because they said, look, you're not going to be electing Doug Ford. You're going to be electing Rod Phillips, Caroline Mulroney, Vic Fideli, Peter Bethlenfalvy, a group of people. It's not just Doug Ford. And that was a very, very smart thing that the Tories did. And I think that next year, if I'm Stephen Del Duca, I'm going to be doing something like that. I'm going to be saying, look, we've got a team that's ready to govern on day one. Andrea Horwath didn't look like she was ready to govern in 2018, even though I really did believe for a couple of days there that I was on the butts of the next Premier of Ontario.
Tim, what was your role in the 2003 Ontario election?
Well, I was actually working in Ottawa at that point, so I was an observer of that. I was co-chair and party president in '99. When
the reason I ask about 2003 is because I do recall that one. Although you got 40% of the vote in a losing effort, that's pretty good.
I know. Yeah.
The reason I asked about 2003 is I was curious about your reaction when you heard somebody who worked for Premier Ernie Eves in that campaign describe Dalton McGuinty as an evil reptilian kitten eater from another planet.
Yes.
What went through your head when you heard that?
Well, those kinds of things, frankly, are desperation tactics, right? And it's a little bit what's been happening in politics that I think all parties suffer from, which is you get kind of these social media enthusiasts, young people who kind of are trying to generate, exciting headlines, and there's no adult supervision. And as you get, more worried about campaign results, people are pushing out more stuff, trying to find something that'll stick. And I think that was one of those. To me, that was a sign that campaign was losing and knew it. And I think so. In other words, it's those kind of things are more a reflection of what's already occurring, in my view, than a driver of something that's going to happen.
We're down to our last minute here, Robert. Let me give it to you because I'm not sure this is going to be a factor in the upcoming election next year, but it certainly has been in the past. And that is overconfidence, either by the person who's got the job or the person who wants the job. What could you tell us about that?
You know what, Steve, I don't think, given the realities of COVID-19 and the pandemic that we have been through these last 15 months, and hopefully by the time the next election rolls around, it will be something in the rearview mirror. But I think in the context of that, I don't think Premier Doug Ford is overconfident. I don't think Andrea Horwath, who will be going for her fourth kick at the can, is overconfident or will be overconfident. And I don't think Stephen Del Duca will be overconfident because he knows that he may have to wear some of the baggage from Premier Wynn's tenure because he was in her cabinet. So I think all of them will be suitably humbled. And I think that's a good thing for all voters.
Janet, very briefly, have you seen it in the past?
Oh, it certainly happened in the past, but I think Robert's right. And I think we're seeing a premier now who's gone through a hell of a first 3 years, and he's learned, and we'll see how it goes next year. But I think all bets are still on at this point.
All bets still on. Thanks so much to the three of you, Janet Eckert, Tim Murphy, Robert Benzie, for spending some time with us tonight on T-minus 1 year and counting. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Steve.
And that is the agenda for Wednesday, June 2nd, 2021. Tomorrow, we will reflect on what we here in Ontario need to think about after the appalling discovery of the remains of 215 children at a former Indigenous residential school site in British Columbia. And we hope you'll join us for that. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.